Hi everyone, in this video, what we will be doing is creating an application to fetch data using the Star Wars API, and then what we will do is unit test it. We will use something called mocked provider from Apollo, and we will unit test the queries, the hooks, and many other things using Jest and React testing library. So let's get started. Okay, so to get started with the project, what I've done is created a GitHub repo in here. I'll leave the link in the bio below, but what it is, we have a branch in here called BoilerPlate. So this is where we start off with the code. Essentially what it is just boilerplate code that we have for a React application where we have configured unit testing with Jest and React testing library. And then what we will do is from scratch, we will import Apollo client, and then we will be able to use GraphQL in this build also. So all you need to do is go to this URL where we have the boilerplate branch. In here, you would just copy this and you would run git clone and then this URL. And then once you have cloned the repository on your local machine, all you need to do is run npm install, and then you will have the boilerplate code set up. So now in my project here, you should have something like this. So the index.tsx file is essentially just rendering the app, which is the app component that has a h1 here of GraphQL fetch and testing. And what we will also have is a test in here just saying renders the course title. So essentially we're getting by text the text here, and then we're expecting that to be in the document. What happens is this ensures that the testing is working for this branch and for this project. So I have a extension in here which is called the Jest extension. So in here, if you scroll down to Jest over here, if you install this, then you can use the tick box here in our test file. So in here, if we click that, it then runs the test for us. And as you can see, the test is now passing. Okay, so let's get started. What I'm going to do is quickly run the project in our browser. So if I go in here and then I just need to go into localhost 3000, we now have the title rendering on the page, which is what we expect. What I want to do now is set up GraphQL and Apollo client in our project. And then what we will do is try and fetch some data from this Star Wars API and get that rendering onto the page. Okay, so now that we have the project set up, what we want to do is fetch this API data from the Star Wars API, but initially we need to set up GraphQL. Essentially what GraphQL is a query language for your APIs where you can select the specific data that you require and not fetch all of the data at once, just like you do in REST. It's an alternative method. So what I want to do is go into my app, and in my terminal, I need to install a few things. So if I close everything off here and look in my package.json, we have testing libraries set up in here, and we also have Jest as well. What I want to do is install something called Apollo client and GraphQL. I'll leave the links for the documentation in the code, but essentially all I want to do is just do npm I apt apollo/client. That is the first package, and then the space, and then we just want to install GraphQL also. So if you press enter and let that run in our terminal, and we can close the package.json down whilst that is installing on our application. And if we reopen it now, we now see GraphQL here, and we also see Apollo client here. You can also put these as dev dependencies, but for the purpose of this build, I'm just going to leave them all in the dependencies object here. So let's close this down now. And in my app.tsx, I now have the app here, but what I want to do is have a wrapper around the Apollo client. So if I go into the browser for a moment and search for Apollo GraphQL, if we just click on Introduction to Apollo Client here and then Get Started. So now we have our start point of what we need to do, and essentially this is the instructions on how to set up the Apollo client on our project. So let's get started with that. So the first step and the second step we have now done, which is install the relevant packages. The next step is to initialize the Apollo client. So what I'm going to do is copy this code here, and I want to create an Apollo client file. So let's create that first of all. And in here, I already have my folder structure set up. So third-party packages go in the lib folder, and I've created a GraphQL folder, which has hooks, queries. But before I go into these folders, I want to create a new file in here called apolloclient.ts. So this is the client that we are going to be making for our higher order component. If I paste in what it says in the documentation, I now have the imports here. What I now want to do is go back into the documentation, and I can just simply copy the second part, which is creating a client like so. So let's create that as well. So now all I'm going to do is rename this to Apollo client in camel case like so, and then I just need to export default of Apollo client. This URL is not the correct URL that we need, so let's go back onto our Star Wars API, which is the one we need, and here we have the endpoint here, so we can just copy this and paste it into our code where it says the URI. What you could also do is put this in the env file and then keep it separate, and then just use process.env dot whatever you name the endpoint for this. I'm just going to keep it as it is now. The Apollo provider and the GQL I'm just going to leave, so we're going to delete this one. So now if I save this, I now have created my client. And if I go back into my index.tsx, I now need to wrap this, but let's go back into the documentation to see the next steps. So if we scroll down, the first thing we need to do is create a query, but we're going to leave that for now. And this is the part what we need to do is connect the client to your React application. So essentially we're going to wrap it around our app like so. So let's go ahead and copy this. And then in our browser here, we're just going to paste this in. And to import Apollo provider, you just need to press Control Spacebar, and then it imports at the top here. And then the client we're going to use is the Apollo client that we have just created in our Apollo client.ts file. So let's go ahead and paste that in here, and then Control Space, and we also need to import this as well. So now if I save, that is that section complete. And just to double check the browser again, if we scroll down, the next step is to fetch the data that we need for this application. So let's go ahead and do that. So before we fetch the data, what GraphQL does, it provides you with a playground. So it says this is the data we will expect to receive when we do our successful fetch on our client side. So in home here, essentially what I have is the Explorer. So if we go into the API here, we have an Explorer here, so you can open it, and this is a playground for your GraphQL queries. So if I go into the Explorer here, for this build, there's quite a few things we can fetch data for, but the data I want to fetch is just the all films. So all we need to do is press the plus here. Essentially, the query is the all films query, and inside here we have a few fields that we can pass. We can either select them on the left side using the plus, or in here we can just type Control Space, and then it brings down what we need as a list in here of what's available in the all films object. What I want is the films object, and then it brings down another drop down here of created, director, edited, and so on. So I want the ID, and I also want the director's name here. So on the right, if we click the blue button here, essentially what happens is it fetches the data. We have a status of 200 in here, and this is the response headers. So what I want to do is press this drop down here and get access to the response. So as you can see here, I have got access to all the films in Star Wars. The individual films is an array of objects that has the ID and the directors inside. And as you can see, most of them are George Lucas, but there's a few that have other directors in as well. So that's how you would make a query on the playground. So the next step is to create a query on the client on our React application, and then from there what we will do is fetch the data onto our application as well. So going back into our app here, I'm just going to close the client and the index because we are done with them now. In our lib folder where we have GraphQL here, we have a hooks folder and a queries folder. So in queries, I'm going to create a new file in here called index.ts like so. And in here, this is the query we are going to be making. So essentially, if we just copy this and paste that in here, what we now need to do is create a constant. So this is going to be const get all films. We'll put this in capitals, is equal to GQL, which is what we need to import from Apollo client at the top here, which has backticks of the query we want. So all we need to do at the end of the query is close it off like so. And then that is query created. All I now need to do is export this query. So all you need to do is export get on filmed like so. So now this query is accessible across the application, and we have also decoupled it from the client. So now all I want to do is create a hook that can get accessed to our component or page that we create, and then that way we will be able to query this specific query here like so. What I also want to do is add a few more fields in here. So we want the title, director, release date, and producers. And if we just test to see if that works as well in the playground and press play, you can see here we have all of the data being fetched correctly and successfully here. So now that I have my query, I now need to create a hook, which is called use all films. and in use all films, I'm going to create a new file called index.tsx. And then this hook is going to be similar to a React functional component, so RAFCE. And then this is going to be called use all films, which doesn't take in an argument, so we can just leave that as is. But what we want is, we don't want to return a div. The first thing we want to do is destructure the data coming back from the use query, which is a hook from Apollo client. So if I just do const, and when we do a use query hook, essentially what happens is it returns back a few objects such as data, loading, and error. So if we tab and import that in, what I want to do is control spacebar to import use query from Apollo client, which essentially says use the query that I pass into this field here. So what I'm going to do is delete this for now. And the query I want to pass into here is the query we have made over here. So get all films. And I'm going to paste that in and control space to import it in as well. And then in my return block, instead of returning a div this time, I'm just going to return the data, loading, and error like so. So in our setup, we have a hooks folder, a queries folder, and a Apollo client. Apollo client is the client that wraps around the application, which is the higher order component of Apollo provider. We have queries where we can add multiple queries based on what you want from the playground, which is over here. And then the last one, which is the hooks, is essentially what we will use in our components to fetch the relevant data that we need and bring it to the client. And then that is returned as either successfully as data, loading state, or an error state. So there's no need for any sort of use states or use effects in this application. So now that we have everything set up on our application for GraphQL, I now just want to create a page. So the first page I want to create is the home page, and the only page we will have in this application. If you wanted multiple pages, then you can use React Router DOM and add the router in here and then render your relevant pages. But for now, what I want to do is in my pages folder, create a new page in here, or a new component called home. And in home, I just want to do RAFCE and press tab, which is essentially a home component. This is a React functional component, so react.fc like so. And then in here, what I want to do is just say home page for now. And then also, we just need to import it from our app like that. So now if I save all, let's just see if that's rendering. We now need to do npm start the application. And then if we go into our browser over here and refresh, as you can see here, we are seeing the home text in here. So what we now want to do is render the list of all of these Star Wars data that we have here onto the page itself. So back in our code, if we go into the home component, what we now need to do is fetch the data from our GraphQL API. We have created a use all films hook. So this is the use all films hook. And what it does, it returns data, loading, and error. So let's use all films hook in our homepage. So in here, before the return block, I want to just paste in use all films, and then I just want to destructure the data, loading, and error in here. And then all I want to do is use control space to import this in from the relevant file path. And then I just want to first of all do it if check. So if it's loading, let's do loading. If it's error, we want to log out the error.message. And then I'm just going to console log the data for now, so we can see what data is coming back from the API. So now if I save all, I'm going to the browser. As you quickly saw there, it was loading and then it went into home. So if we inspect the page in our console, you can see here we are getting an object back with all the data inside. So that is all film, and then films, which is an array, and it is the same structure coming back from what we have queried in our playground over here. So let's just render it out onto the page. So let's go back into here, and instead of a div, what we want to do is add parentheses around here. And in here, we have access to the data now. So let's destructure the data first of all and get access to all films. So const all films is equal to data, which is the same as data.allFilms. And then I'm just going to use JSS brackets in here to access all films. So all films.films.map, which is essentially getting all of the films that we have seen. In here, we want to render a div, which has a key of film.id and a h1 of film.title, like so. We can do the same for the rest of them and close it off like that. So now if I save, essentially if all films is there, then we want to access films, and then we want to map over it. So what I want to do is just add optional chaining in here to say that if it is there, then proceed, otherwise we would get an error. So Let's save that and see if it renders anything on the page. And as you can see, you get in the title, and then we also get in the release date here, like so. And that is the same for the list of 5 items in the array of films in here, or the 6 items. So now we have successfully fetched the data for the films. I just want to clean it up a little bit, so I'm just going to create a new all films component. So let's quickly create that. So in our component folder, I'm going to create a new file in here called allfilms.tsx, which essentially is the component that we are creating. So it's the card that is created for each individual film. So refc tab of all films, and then in here we want to do react.fc like so, and then export default of all films. And we do know that all films receives props, so I'm just going to pass in the film in here, and then we will be able to access the film in here to render what we need. So if I go into my all films component, I'm essentially going to be returning the following, which I'm going to paste in, which is the title, the release date, the director, and the producers. So we just need to pass that in now. So in our homepage over here, essentially what I want to do is render the all films component, passing in the key, and then also we want to pass in the film which is equal to the film which is coming from here. So essentially for each film that we have, we want to render the all films component, or we could rename this to film container actually. So let's rename that film container, which makes more sense. And then we just need to close this off as well. So let's go ahead and rename that and import it in. And we just need to go to the component now and do the same here. So we do know it receives a film prop. So what we now need to do is take care of the types. So this is done with TypeScript, and we also need to import this from our components / film container like so. So film, if we hover over it, essentially it has any type. So we need to define the film type. So in our types folder, I'm going to create an index file. So index.ts, as we are not rendering any JSX in here. And what we receive is data. So I'm just going to bring in my types and paste them in. Essentially, we have a data type first, because the data is coming from the Apollo client of all films, which we destructure from the data here. So that is all films. And then what we are doing is in our index, we have a films type, which is the array of films that we have. And each film has an ID, a title, director, release date, and producers, which is essentially an array of strings in here. So now we have that information. If I go back to the home page, each individual film is going to be of a specific type, which is the films type here. So let's go ahead and copy that. And instead of any, we just need to paste in the films type and control space. We're importing that from the types. So the next error is coming in the film container. So let's go into that one. And then the film type here is going to be the same. So to add the types of film, all you need to do is at the end of React FC, if we hover over it, at the minute, it's got a empty object in there, but what we want to pass in is the film type that we are passing down. So let's create that and then paste it in. And we just need to do control spacebar and enter there, hover over it. It says film does not exist on type films type. So let's see what's going on there. There's a little mistake I've just made, which is I need to define the interface for this component. So interface of film container props, film is of films type, and then we just close that off. So instead of the films type in here, we just need to paste that in here like so. So if I save and then open my browser, as you can see here, we have successfully fetched all of the data and everything is working correctly. And that's how you fetch data from GraphQL. What I also want to do is delete the console log on the home page, so we don't need that anymore because the client for GraphQL is working and our application is fetching the data correctly. So now what I want to do next is to look at how we would test the hooks and the queries and make sure the client is working. And we will look at how to test it on React Testing Library and Jest, along with using something called the mock provider from Apollo client. So when it comes to React Testing Library and Jest in general, there's quite a lot of topics to cover. But what I want to do is specifically focus on the Apollo client testing, in particular the mocked provider, because we are using GraphQL and the Apollo provider in here. This basically gives us an example where we have a mock in here and then we test to see if that mock works. So Essentially, we want to test to see if the query works and then also if the right text is rendering onto our relevant components in here. So going back into our code, what I want to do is create a test for this use all films hook. So if we do that, I have created a new folder underscore test in here. So all I want to do in here is just create a index.test.tsx file in here. And before I do anything, I also have a mocks folder. So in here, this is where I want to put in all of our mocks for the tests that I use in this application. So if I create a file in here, and I'm just going to call this allfilms.tsx, because you could have different queries. So you could have an individual film, which we are not covering in this one, but essentially the individual film is essentially the same query as this one, but instead it takes in an ID. And this is shown in the documentation over in the Star Wars app here. So essentially, if you delete that and go back, you pass in the film and then you can choose the argument that it takes. So you can pass in the ID and then fetch the relevant data like so. And then you would, instead of this ID here, you would replace it with another ID. But for now, we'll leave that on this project. So going back in here, I've got a mocks file now of all films, and the first mock I want to do is essentially all of the films data, which is what we receive from our queried data from the application. So if I paste that in, essentially instead of having 6 films, I've just got one object in here, which is for the title of A New Hope. You could put in anything in here, you could change the ID and so on. This is just a mock so that we can use for our mocked data. So if you think about what this all films data is doing, if we go into the use all films hook in here, essentially what we expect is the data to be the same data of what we have created in here, which is the all films data. So that is the outcome we would test for once we have the object of the data coming back. The loading will be a Boolean and then the error will be a new Apollo error. So we will test all 3 of them in our unit test. So if I create a describe block, first of all, and we also need to, on every after each method here, we just need to add a cleanup, which comes from testing library in React. And the first describe block is essentially going to test if use all film hooks works correctly, then and is successful, what do we expect to be the outcome? So we also need to do the same thing again, but for when it errors. So use all film hook when it errors. And we will look at this one later on. So in here, what I want to do is I want to kind of mimic the hook. So essentially mimic the use query hook in here, passing in the successful and error response, and then expecting the data to equal something, the loading to equal something, and the error. So I now need to create a custom hook, which I'm going to create. It's essentially going to be a wrapper. So in our mocks here, underneath all films data, first of all, what I want to do is create a successful mock of what happens when we successfully mock the use film hook. And we also want a errored mock of the use film hook like so, which is fine, but we need some sort of wrapper that mimics the functionality of the use all films custom hook. So let's create that now. So this can be reused across both when we just pass in the relevant mock for success or error, and then this is what we will return. So it'll become more clear when we work through it together. So first of all, I'm going to create a function. So I'm going to export this function. So export function of get all films wrapper, I'm going to call it, which is essentially a function that takes in an argument. And in this function, we return something as well. So in here, we will return a result. So I'm going to leave this for now. We need to declare a few things in here. The first thing we need to declare is get all films wrapper receive some sort of mock data. So I'm going to pass this in here. So mock data, and this is going to be of type mocked response, which comes from Apollo client. So I will import this in. So this is essentially comes in at the top, which is a mocked response of Apollo client testing. So the mock response we expect is going to be an array. And then what I also want to do is add a fallback in here of just an empty array, which is essentially if there's no mock data passed, then just pass in an empty array here. So that's the first part done. The second part is I want to create a wrapper. So let's declare a variable for that. So const wrapper is equal to, this is like a higher order component where it receives children. So it's going to be mocked provider. So this is in the documentation, and it receives children, which is coming from here. and this is going to be react.props with children. Just comment this out for now. And mocked provider is also coming from Apollo client testing. So what this is the same as the Apollo provider, which is in our index.tsx here, which is essentially mimicking the Apollo provider, but it's a little different. The client is going to be the mocks, which is here, is equal to the mock data that we pass in. And then we can also add the type name of false, which essentially is removing the type name that gets added onto the object that we fetch the data from. So we're having the mock provider and we're passing in the children in here. So that is the wrapper now. And if I save, first of all, so now I've created the wrapper. I want to now get access to the render hook coming from testing library. So let's get that and get the result in here. So I want to destructure the result from the render hook method. So we could do it like so, which is render hook coming from testing library. And then the first argument is going to be the hook that I have created, which is use all films in here, and then the second argument is the wrapper. So all I want to now do is return the result in here like so. So now I have created a mimicking function. When we pass in these mock data in here, it will then return and mimic the functionality of this use all films hook in here like so. So if I now get access to this in our test, so I just need to save first of all. What I also need to do is destructure in here like that. And then if I go into my first describe block here and test a successful response. So what I now need to do is destructure the result I'm getting. So const result is equal to get all films wrapper, which we need to import in from our relevant file. I'm just going to add a quick fix in here, and then what we now need to do is do something with the results. So I'm going to do it block first of all, and the first test I want to do is expect result to be defined. So let's check if that is defined. So now if I save and press this button here on the left, this means now the test is passing and we are now getting a result to be defined. So that is the first part of the test working correct. What I also want to do is rename this, which is essentially should be defined and return the correct data. So now that test is passing. What I want to do is pass in a successful argument into here, or a successful mock, and I also want to do the same for the errored mock. So in our mocks folder in here, all we now need to do is create a successful mock and an errored mock. So let's go ahead and do that. So first of all, I'm going to export a constant of a successful mock, and I'm just going to call it successful all films mock to be more specific. And this is going to be an array which essentially has a request and a result. So essentially the query is going to be the query we have made. So if we go in query, it is essentially get all films. That is the query we want, and we need to import that in. And then the data we receive once successful is the all films data that we have defined just above over here. So that is the successful all films mock there. I also want to infer this type as the mocked response, which is coming from here. So let's copy that and paste that in here, because this is a mocked response coming from the Apollo client / testing library in here. So that one is complete now. We also need to do the same for an errored mock. So let's copy this, paste it in here, and this is going to be called errored all films mock like so. This again has a mocked response. It has the same request, but this time we don't receive a result. We receive an error. So let's put in error in here. And what I want to do is be more specific with this error. So this is an Apollo error, like so. And in this Apollo error, we get GraphQL errors. So what I want to do is control space, import in the Apollo error at the top as well from the Apollo client. In here, I have an object, and this object will return a GraphQL errors here. And this is an array. And in here, it will be new GraphQL error, which also we need to import. So let's go down to this one and let me import that in as well. And the GraphQL error is essentially, oops, the fetch was unsuccessful, something like that. And then what we need to do is close this off, this array off here like so. So now we have imported the GraphQL error from GraphQL and the Apollo error from Apollo client. And then I can delete these comments because we've created them now. So now if I save and now have a few mocks in here. I have all of my films data. I have a successful all films mock, an errored all films mock, and then my get all films wrapper, which is essentially a higher order component that is mocking the use query hook that we have and is the use all films hook that we have, and then passing in the wrapper as the second argument. So in here now, what I want to do is pass in the successful all films mock, because this is the all films when successful in here. So now if I save all, we should expect a result to be defined, because essentially this is working. So if we test again one more time, this test is now passing, which is correct. So now that that test is working correctly, what I want to do is add another test to check that the correct data is being rendered. So first of all, I have an async in here, and I want to do await wait for. In here, I want to check for the expect the result.current to equal a certain object. So let's do that. So expect result.current to equal, and then this is going to be an object of loading of false, error of undefined, and then the data of all film data, which is what we defined in our mocks. So now all we need to do is close this await for block off as well in here, like so. So now if I save all and then I run this test again, let's see if this one passes, which it does in here as well. So essentially, when we pass in a successful all films mock, then that works. What if I typed in an error, see if it still works, which it shouldn't do, because what we have done is define that differently. So if I now save and then run the test again, this test should now fail because the result is completely different. It should return and receive an error here. Oops, the fetch was unsuccessful. So if I go back and return it to successful all film mock in here like so, run the test again. Now that test is working correctly. So I just need to do the same thing again, but this time it's going to be for an error. So let's uncomment this one out. After each, I'm going to, instead of the successful, it's going to be the errored. So errored all films mock in here. Then I want to expect the result to be defined, which is what we have done. So I'm going to create a new block in here, just underneath of expect the result to be defined like so. And then this test should pass because we should have a result, which it does. And then instead of this object being returned, all we now need to do is expect a different outcome. So if I just copy the result.current, this should be undefined now. Let's just check if that works and save. What will happen is this test will fail as well because the error is not undefined this time. The error is a GraphQL error. So as you can see here, it says Apollo error, oops, the fetch was unsuccessful. We need to define the error in here. So what we have done in our errored response is we have done the following, which is a new Apollo error, which is of GraphQL errors, and then this is unsuccessful in here. So let's just copy this and paste it in this one here. What you also want to do is import these from the relevant places we need them from. So now if I save and run this test again, as you can see now, we have done a successful response and an errored response in here as well, like so. So that is how you would test a use query custom hook using the mocked provider. We create our mocks in our separate mocks folder. In the test, we just import them and expect the relevant outcomes coming from the result.current, which we have created in our custom hook, which is the get all films wrapper in here. And the same for this one as well. So now what I also want to do is check to see if our components are rendering the correct data also. So if we go in our film container component, I'm just going to create a new file in the components folder called filmcontainer.test.tsx. So this is what you would also expect in a production environment. So we will need to test to see if this receives the correct data. So we will use the all film mock data that we have created in here. So all we need to do is we want to render the film container component. So let's create a describe block first of all. And the first argument is always a string that contains what you expect this to be. So this is the film container. And then I just want to close this off. And in here, I'm just going to have an after each as well of cleanup. And then we just need to import this in from our testing library React. And we just need to close this after each off in here. And then I'm just going to be testing a simple test. So let's just create a simple test for now, like so. And the test is going to be should render the correct information in the component. So that's essentially what it is. So now save all. I now need to delete this, and I want to render the component. So let's render the component first of all, which is the film container, and this receives props in here. So the film is equal to, and I'm going to just pass in the old films data coming from the mocks in here. So if we just double check that, is essentially all the films data in here. So what we want to do now is go into it deeper. So it will be allfilms.allfilms.films, and we just want to access the first index in here. So what I could do is create an object in here of const props, and film is going to be equal to all films data. If I just close this off, dot all films dot films, and we want the first index in here like so. And I also need to import render from testing library React. The film container is being imported from the relevant component here, and now all I want to do is spread in the props here. So that's how you spread in props. So now if I save, okay, so now we have an error in here. So let's just check what that is. So type string is not assignable to type string in an array. So let's go into the type. So in our films type in here, all we need to do is get this and paste it in here like so. And then that should fix the error, which it has done also. So now all I want to do is quick fix this. So now in my test, I just want to get access to the text. So essentially get by text of A New Hope, George Lucas, date, and also the producer name, and I expect them to be in the document. So now if I save, all I now need to do is run the test. So there is an error here, so let's just see what the error is. So the error says unable to find an element with the text A New Hope. This could be because the text is broken by multiple elements. In this case, you can provide a function for your text matcher to make it more flexible, or let me just see if I can just quickly do regex on this to see if this passes, and we can comment the rest out. So expect A New Hope to be in the document. If we rerun the test, you can see that's working correctly, and it would be the same for these ones as well. This should now pass if I just rerun the test again. Screen.getByText A New Hope, and you can put these in variables to make them more neater, but this is just a simple test to see that the text is rendering correctly from my all films object in here, and the text is correct. So to test that this is working, if I was to change A New Hope in here and delete and save, and then rerun this test in film container, this will now fail because A New Hope is not in the document in here. As you can see, it's A New Hope. So let's just go back to that and save all, and then rerun this test, and now this test should also pass, which it has done. So that is the two ways to unit test with Apollo Client. We have our query test in here, which uses certain mocks, and we also have our component test, where we can test to see if the relevant fetch data text renders onto our screen in here. So what I will do now is create a new branch in here. So hit checkout -b, and this new branch is the completed build, and then I will commit these changes onto there, and this final build will be in the links below as well. I hope you liked this video and it helped you a lot. Please like and subscribe so I can make more of these videos, but for now I will see you on the next video. Thanks.